Learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to know about Erik Erikson and his postulated theory, learn about the stages of psychosocial development, identify the key areas of Erikson's theory, evaluate Erikson's theory in comparison to Freud's theory, analyze Erikson's theory and list his contributions and criticism. Introduction. Erik Erikson is a post-Freudian theorist who has made a major contribution to Freud's theory of personality, and he has had a profound influence on psychoanalysis. He has been an impelling force in changing the culture of personality. He was trained into the Freudian tradition by Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. Erikson developed an approach to personality that was far different from Freud's theory, yet quintessential, based on the same principles. Erikson provided an extension to Freud's theory by adding more stages to it and providing a more global and detailed approach. Erikson was mostly in sync with Freud's approach and believed that crises that happen in adult life are related to unresolved childhood conflicts. However, Erikson propounded that culture and familial relations were as important as sexual urges in the development of an individual. Erikson was a patron of what he termed as the psychosocial struggle that takes place in an individual where he battles between his own personal impulses and his social world. As mentioned earlier, according to Erikson, cultural and societal relations have an impact on individuals on how they act, behave, react to their surroundings. Individuals grow and learn in an environment greatly influenced by such connections. Each psychosocial struggle represents a stage according to Erikson, and successful resolving of these stages leads to strengthening of one's personality. Erikson identified 8 different stages in the life cycle of development. Each individual stage deals with different psychosocial factors leading to emergence of self, the search for identity, relationship with others and the role of culture in life. Even though Erikson was a believer of psychoanalysis, he verged off from Freud's theory vastly. He expanded Freud's theory in 3 major ways. First, he rather bloated Freud's stages of development. Freud emphasized childhood experiences and the notion of personality shaping being compellent by early childhood. Erikson instead proposed that the personality develops in 8 stages over the entire lifespan. Erikson's second definition from Freud's theory was to place ego as something not in obedience or conflict with it, rather as an independent entity taking its own form over the course of development. He believed that ego had its own functions relating to the growth and health of an individual, different from those of it. Thirdly, as mentioned earlier, Erikson emphasized that culture was not a factor to be ignored on its impact and shaping of personality. He argued that all the innate factors cannot be the sole contributors to the growth and development of an individual regardless of their importance. Core concepts of the theory. The ego in post-Freudian theory. Freud's concept of ego was quite quintessential from the concept of ego as defined by Erikson. Freud postulated that ego as an entity has no force of its own and relies unabashedly on superego and it for all decisions. Freud proposed that ego borrows energy from it and is constantly in a state of thrill as it tries to maintain a balance between the id and the superego. Freud stated that the id is blind in his relentless pursuit of pleasure with little care for the external factors, and superego wants to always take the moral high ground. Ego forms an alliance with both id and superego by appeasing them both in relation to the real world. Freud believed that for psychologically healthy people, the ego is sufficiently developed to reign in the id, even though its control is still tenuous and id impulses might erupt and overwhelm the ego at any time. In contrast, Erikson held that our ego is a force that creates our self-identity, a sense of I. As an anchor to our personality, our ego helps us modify and adapt to the various conflict and crises of life. It protects us from losing sight of our individuality to the myriad forces of society. During childhood, the ego is weak, feeble and fragile, but by adolescence, it begins to take form, gain strength and perspective. Erikson seeks to explain ego as a fragmented, unconscious, organizing agency that incorporates one's present life experiences with past self-identities and also with foreseen expected images of self. He defined the ego as a person's ability to unify experiences and actions in an adaptive manner. Erikson explained three correlated aspects of ego: the body ego, the ego ideal and ego identity. The body ego refers to experiences that one has with their own body, a way of seeing one's physical self as different for other people. It proposes that one can be content or discontent with one's body's outer appearance, but always maintains that the same person realizes that this is the only body they will ever have. The ego ideal represents the contrasting image one has of them in comparison with an established or expected ideal self. It is responsible for one's satisfaction or dissatisfaction with not only their physical self, but with the entire personal identity. Ego identity is the image one has of themselves in a variety of social roles they play. Although adolescence is the time when these three components are interacting and changing most quickly, alteration in body ego, ego ideal and ego identity can and do take place at any stage of life. Societal influences. Another important component of Erikson theory was his belief that ego is largely and predominantly shaped by the society. Erikson, through his work, sets out to emphasize the social, historical and cultural environment that an individual is raised in contrast to the biological viewpoint stated by Freud. Erikson mostly agrees with Freud in stating that ego is a greatly potentiality at the birth, but according to him, it cannot exist without a cultural environment. According to Erikson, different societies have very different child rearing practices that are developed in close synchronization with the cultural needs and personal identities. For example, Erikson suggested that excessive and long feeding of infants by parents in Sioux tribes might not lead to fixation at an oral stage as proposed by Freud. Instead, he states that Sioux tribes places a greater emphasis on generosity, which is greatly related to reassurance a child gets through prolonged breastfeeding. Therefore, we can assume that Erikson challenges the preconceived notion as explained by the Freudian concept of ego and its intermittent relation with just the inherent biological instincts. He is amongst the first to define and exfoliate the virtues of a social environment and there being no one perfect or exemplary way of rearing children. Epigenetic principle. Another major aspect of Erikson theory is epigenetic principle. In this, the development in the heritable changes of gene activity is not due to DNA sequence, rather it is caused by anything but genes. Erikson, through his epigenetic principle, outlines the development of ego through various stages in a predetermined sequence and a fixed pattern. It states clearly the mandate order in which one stage surges out of the other and the independent role of each stage. This epigenetic principle also states that each stage might supplement the other, but never replace it. The epigenetic development is conative with the physical growth seen in children too, as they learn to babble before they speak and so on. Erikson, through this principle, highlights that every action, function or anomaly develops out of a base and other parts arise using that base as groundwork. Therefore, all parts have their paths set to form an functioning whole. Stages of development. Erik Erikson postulated 8 stages of psychosocial development. The first 4 are closely related to Freud's oral, anal, phallic and latency stages. The major difference between these theories is that Erikson emphasized psychosocial correlates, whereas Freud focused on innate biological factors. In Erikson's theory, human development of the psychosocial stages involves the epigenetic principle and a series of personal conflicts. According to Erikson, the potential for these conflicts exists at birth as innate predispositions. These will become prominent at different stages when our environment demands certain adaptations. Each confrontation with our environment is called a crisis. The crisis involves a shift in perspective, requiring us to refocus our instinctual energy in accordance with the needs of each stage of the life cycle. Each developmental stage has its particular crisis or turning point that necessitates some changes in our behavior and personality. We may respond to the crisis in one of the two ways, a maladaptive way or an adaptive way. Only when we have resolved each conflict can the personality continue its normal developmental sequence and acquire the strength to confront the next stage's crisis. If the conflict at any stage remains unresolved, we are less likely to be able to adapt to later problems. A successful outcome is still possible, but it will be more difficult to achieve. Oral sensory stage, basic trust versus mistrust. The oral sensory stage of psychosocial development, analogous to Freud's oral stage of psychosexual development, occurs during the early period of life. This is the time when our needs are particularly those of a helpless and dependent individual. The infant is completely and invocably dependent on the mother or primary caregiver for survival, security and affection. During this stage, the mouth is considered the zone for gratification. Sensations related to the mouth focus on pleasure through breastfeeding. Freud and Erikson both outline the importance of fulfillment through mouth related activities and the overall primitive contribution that this stage makes to the development of the individual. Erikson differs in that he states that the biological factors do not provide the only compelling evidence for the complete development cycle. He states that the relations between an infant and the world are also social. The infant's subsequent communication with the mother or caregiver determines if the baby adapts a temperament of trust or mistrust in his further associations with the surrounding environment. This attitude of trust or mistrust also shapes the infant's personality. The level of significance the society places on the role of the parenting determines the effect it has on the infant's growth. If the society places great importance and extols the virtue of motherhood, the result is that of a mother who is highly motivated, productive as a parent and has a healthy attachment to her baby. Contrarily, if the society is patronizing towards the status of motherhood, the mother might show relatively distant to her job as a caretaker and provider. In Erikson's view, the mother's action should be stable, practicable and continuous for the infant to develop basic trust. As the infant progressively connects with the mother, he comes to associate with her through sight, smell, touch and sound. The infant's first social accomplishment is when he is unperturbed by the unduly absence of the mother and is secure in the knowledge that she will return to his side to nurture and take care of him. This solid conviction that an infant develops is the basis for his ego development, where he recognizes that people are dependable. This basic trust is not partial or even one-sided, rather the mother and the infant both interact effectively to make for a healthy relationship. the fostered trust of the infant and the mother's dependability are mingled. As the infant develops teeth, he or she is driven to bite. The infant must learn not to engage in this behavior, causing the mother to withdraw in anger or pain. If the infant learns and acts appropriately, the mother comes to the set trust in her child and both parties can have a successful relationship. In contrast, a sense of basic mistrust emerges if the mother acts in an unreliable, aloof and rejecting way. The mother lacks of dependability and care is likely to depress, frustrate and anger the infant, who as a result becomes more precociously in his behavior. This feeling of mistrust continues to be present in the later stages of development too, if left unresolved. Thus, the overall interpersonal experiences with the mother are contributors to developing an attitude of trust or mistrust. Muscular-Anal stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Erikson's second stage is in close tandem with Freud's second stage too. This stage, according to both theorists, happen in the second and the third years of life. Children at this stage are able to develop an array of physiological and cognitive abilities that help them carry out many tasks. They are not quite adept at performing tasks such as communicating, walking, climbing, pushing, pulling, holding on to objects. Children develop a sense of accomplishment if they complete these tasks effectively and wish to undertake as many activities as possible, all for themselves. This is a crucial period. Parents at this stage generally engage in toilet training activities. Children must be skilled at controlling their anal muscles so as to discharge waste material from the body appropriately. Erikson also points out that the different societies have different outlooks on this stage and the appropriate training method required for elimination of bodily waste. He draws out the example of egalitarian society, in which parents take no part in toilet training and expect the older generation of children to teach the younger ones the expected conduct for bodily waste discharge. Erikson wanted to emphasize that the conflict related to discharge of waste, as Freud postulated, was not universal and only homologous to Western societies which lay claim to a civilized notion of cleanliness, propriety and punctuality. Children must be trained to obey, and this leads to a conflict of wills and a power struggle between parents and children. Coincidentally, at this stage, children who have learned to trust their parents and the world, they must now learn how to assert their independence too. They need to be strong-willed to be able to master some activities on their own for self-achievement. They must be able to establish what they can by themselves. A sense of autonomy and self-control is the result of parents' trust and gradual guidance. Parents support their children when he undertakes a task and helps him set his own limits. There is also a flip side to this. If parents are either too permissive or too harsh and demanding during this stage, children experience a sense of defeat that leads to shame, which is the feeling of doubt concerning their abilities to make effective judgments and to exercise control over their lives. One result of this may be neurotic attempts to regain control by compulsive actions. Individuals that develop a sense of control over their lives become compulsive to the extent where they follow all rules and regulations as dictated by laws. According to Erikson, children should develop a proportion of 3: autonomy, shame and doubt, with a higher proportion of autonomy. Children who develop too little autonomy have eventually difficulties adapting to later stages of life. Locomotor-Genital stage, initiative versus guilt. The third stage, as prescribed by Erikson, is that of genital locomotive and is incompatible with Freud's psychosexual phallic stage. Both the theorists agree that this stage manifests itself between ages 3 to 5. Erikson saw that the Oedipus complex as a drama played out in the child's imagination that included his grasp of basic concepts such as reproduction, growth, future and death. He reiterated that the Oedipus complex was very fragile and transitory. He stated that a child may take on many roles that are present around him by pretending to be the mother, the father, the wife or the husband, but these roles are not an imposition of his genital conflict, rather an expression of his developed locomotor abilities. A little girl may envy boys not because of the apparent lack of penis and a sense of unfairness towards themselves, rather because of the prerogatives granted to the boy with a penis. Boys might have anxiety about castration not due to their unrequited love for their mothers and a vanguard thirst towards their fathers, but rather due to their need for more love and attention. The Oedipus complex is, according to the Erikson, is sufficiently framed, not an elaborate concoction of unreciprocated sexual feelings towards the parents, but just a mere promise of things to come. Unless sexual interest is advocated or inculcated in children through culture, sex plays or by adult sexual abuse, the Oedipus complex has no detrimental effects on later personality development. The increasing play with genital areas have a high comorbidity with increased facility as locomotion. Latency stage, industry versus inferiority. Erikson latency stage of psychosocial development concurs with Freud latency period 2. This stage usually occurs at ages 6 to 11. The child expands his social environment and start going to school. Various social environments have multiple influences on the child and shape his developing personality too. This is stage when industrious develops, the child involves himself in work both at home, at school and diligently tries to accomplish allotted tasks. The child engages in set behaviors so as to attain reward and to gain the satisfaction derived from completing a task successfully. This is the stage where there is enormous amount of social growth followed with little or no sexual development. The child shows growth with increase in reasoning, spatial and rule following skills. The child now understands patterns and the need for order. He can apply these principles to games and refine his understanding to the world. However, whatever the activities associated with this age, the children made deliberate and directed attempts to complete a task by applying concentrated attention, assiduous care and persistence. In other words, the child soon becomes equipped to deal with the world as adults do. He can now use the same tools as them, apply the principles and understand relation in the same manner. Identity versus role confusion, the identity crisis. This is the stage between the ages 12 to 18 where individuals deal with the conflict of self and ego identity. Individuals start forming a self-image, the idea one has to one's ability, competence, appearance and behavioral characteristics. This self-image is also in part to make what others think of us, their views about us. This stage is resolved effectively leads to a consistent picture about oneself. Identity formation and its acceptance are tremendous tasks with a great deal of importance. At this stage, adolescents experience with themselves various roles in society etc. and they decide which one is most suitable for them. Conflict resolution of previous stages also provide breeding grounds for a healthy self-identity. Individuals grow up feeling important and wish to be someone. Adolescents at this stage want to assert their independence and wish to explore various avenues available to be able to decide what suits them best. They enter this stage with fragmented sense of identity and residual abilities left from the previous stages. During adolescence, the reconstruction process allows individuals to combine their childhood identities and integrate various sexual and aggressive feelings within the accepted boundaries of social roles. The sense of ego identity is then congruent to what the individual experienced in the past with also new added experiences of the present day. Identity has many forced characteristics. It refers to conscious sense of uniqueness and direction derived from a variety of psychosocial experiences that are inculcated by the ego. This is the stage which is rampant with identity crisis and can take various forms. Martyrdoms is one such crisis. It happens between childhood and adulthood in which individuals attempt to solve problems. If the problems remain unsolved, The individual starts searching for a new identity again, even at later stages in life. Another type of identity crisis faced by most adolescents is that of role confusion, where they are unable to decide what they are and what they want to become. Adolescents during role confusion are distraught, which stumble between many of the inner sexual rights and social roles accepted by society. Erikson also maintained that in such an unsettled period, confused youths try to establish their identities by over-identifying with an assortment of heroes. Young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. After the complete resolution of the previous stage, the emergent identity at this stage needs to be fused with the identity of another person, while withholding their sense of individuality too. During the years 19 to 30, the individual is ridden with an increasing need for companionship and procreation at this stage. Healthy young adults are able to enter into intimate relationship with others without damaging their own singularity or that of those in relationship with them. These individuals are able to commit to a relationship and their partners even in the face of adversity conditions or high demanding roles. Erikson highlights the difference between intimate relations and intimacies. Intimacies are relations based on coitus, whereas intimate relations signify close emotional bonds with other person. Erikson believed that for a truly intimate relationship, it is important that both parties involved have their own sense of identity and individuality established. Middle adulthood, generativity versus stagnation. This is the second last stage of development according to Erikson. This is adulthood, lasting from almost 30 to 60 years of one's life. It is the longest course of development where the prototype is that of raising children. People begin to take their places in society as adults and parents. The need to be responsible grows with a strong sense of obligation to procreate and leave one's legacy behind. However, procreativity is not just the birth of an offspring. It is a sense of assuming responsibility for reluctant offsprings and making sure of its healthy growth as an individual. Generativity is a result of mature love and commitment from the previous stage, but it does not mean that the procreation cannot occur before the preceding stages. Individuals are more capable physically to produce and have an infant, whereas their bodies allow. Generativity, however, is not just having children, it is the compulsion to also want to take care of them, shelter them and protect them. People need to be able to learn and able to preach the ideas of new creation and new things. This is the need for them to generally care about not just one's intimate family, but also about society and the younger ones present in them. As the generativity grows out of love, it is not enough to just have a singular bond with one's partner. Individuals need to incorporate children into their cycle of love, make sure that they are transmitted all the cultural and evolutionary tactics essential for survival. The opposite or malfunction of this stage is self-absorption and stagnation. The generational cycle is damaged or neglected when individual becomes too involved within themselves or become too self-indulgent. Late adulthood, ego integrity versus despair. The eighth and the last stage of development is old age. It is stage where one reflects on life and its meaning. Procreation is not necessarily absent, but nor is the basis of aim of this stage. Erikson did not elaborate much upon the stage and state that this is a period of many and diverse sensations. Some people may become actively involved in traditional opposite sex activities. Men become more nurturing, more accepting of the pleasure and non-sexual relationship, indulging those with the grandchildren and great children. Women become more interested and involved in politics, finance and world affairs. The generalized attitude at this stage is that of integrity to hold things together even in the face of despair. Summary: Erikson 8 stages of psychosocial development are based upon an epigenetic principle stating that these stages have a step-by-step progression. It is essential that the former stage be thoroughly passed to move towards onto the next stage. During every stage, people experience an interaction of opposing healthy and impaired attitude which lead to psychosocial crisis. Resolution of each crisis successfully leads to a basic strength that help individual channel their strength onto the next stage. Each stage have biological as well as cultural significance, and each ego strength has an underlying core pathology that postpones development. The first stage of development is infancy, the oral sensory mode. The psychosocial crisis is that of a basic trust versus mistrust. The basic strength is of hope and the core pathology is of withdrawal. During early childhood, the anal stage, the psychosocial conflict of autonomy versus shame and doubt, the basic strength of will and the core pathology of compulsion. During the play age, genital locomotor stage, a psychosocial crisis of initiative versus guilt with either the basic strength of purpose or the core pathology of inhibition. School age children, the latency stage, face the psychosocial crisis of industry versus inferiority with the basic strength of competence or the core pathology of inertia. Adolescence, the ego identity stage with the psychosocial struggle of identity confusion, the basic strength of fidelity, role and repetition is the core pathology. Young adulthood, the psychosocial crisis of intimacy versus isolation, the basic strength of love and the core pathology of exclusivity. Adulthood, the psychosocial crisis of generativity versus stagnation, the basic strength of care and the core pathology of rejectivity. Old age, the crisis of integrity versus despair and the basic strength of wisdom or the core pathology of disdain. Erikson theory had a major impact in areas such as counseling, psychiatry, child psychology, etc. This theory has a large applied value and is exceedingly comprehensive. The theory, though comprehensive, lacks empirical validation and proper research, leading to therefore a theory that is at times easily challenged. In conclusion, it can be said that Erikson's contribution to the field of psychology has been tremendous and no one can undermine his theory's importance in making psychoanalysis what it is today.